I'll start. Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to Clinical Cancer Trials, Removing the Mystery and Opening the Eyes to the Potential, which is an online discussion presented by Mary Crowley Cancer Research and Cancer Support Community, North Texas. Our goal today, which is National Clinical Trials Day during National Cancer Research Month, is to dispel the myths that surround clinical trials for cancer patients, shed light on how the practice works, and discuss how North Texas is a hub for cutting-edge trials, as well as a leader in supporting patients. I'm Will Maddox. I am managing editor of DCEO magazine. I write about healthcare, cover healthcare. I'm far from an expert in the world of cancer and clinical trials, but luckily we have some experts here, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. So today we have several panelists who are going to help us understand these issues. First, we have Dr. James Strauss, who serves as principal investigator for multiple clinical trials at Mary Crowley and has been practicing and studying hematology and oncology for more than 40 years. We're also joined by Mirchelle Lewis. She's the CEO of Cancer Support Community North Texas and is a tenured mental health professional who has dedicated the past 10 years to integrating psychosocial and emotional support into cancer treatment. We also have Tina Nghiem, who works with pharmaceutical companies and contract research organizations to create a pipeline of clinical trials at Mary Crowley Cancer Research. And finally, we have Jackie Castillo, who's a licensed clinical social worker at Mary Crowley and has 15 years of experience working with adults in crisis. So as we talk today, feel free to utilize the chat function or leave a comment on Facebook. If you have questions, we will have a time at the end where we will be fielding questions. So leave those there and we'll get around those to those at the end. So we're going to start with Dr. Strauss. So this is a sort of my interpretation, walking in blind to the world of clinical trials. And so it might be some of our viewers' opinion as well. I imagine the average consumer, the average person out in the world kind of feels like clinical trials are this last second Hail Mary effort when no other options are available, where patients sort of agree to be kind of this guinea pig for unproven therapies, like as a last ditch effort to save themselves. What I'm learning is that is far from the case, that's sort of an antiquated view of the clinical trial world. And so I want to just check in with you and ask you to help me understand sort of what Mary Crowley Cancer Research does and how clinical trials actually work.
Okay, well, thank you, Will. And thanks to the cancer support community. It's always great to be able to work with them. It's such a wonderful organization that has really been very helpful, supportive to patients for many years. So I'm pleased that we're able to work together on this. So to get to your question, what is Mary Crowley Cancer Research about? This is a clinic that is our clinic is a freestanding enterprise that is supported by a nonprofit foundation, Mary Crowley Foundation, for the purpose of helping develop new treatment in cancer. And the way we go about that is to conduct what are known as clinical trials or clinical studies. So these are studies in which people are treated with new treatments, drugs or vaccines, medications that are very early in development. So these are these drugs or treatments are substances that are approved by the FDA for research only. They're not on the market, they're not for sale, they're at a very early point in development. Now that doesn't mean that in some ways they're not brand new. The typical story, each one of these studies has a story behind it that often extends for many, many years of research activities in the lab and investigations in various cancer cell lines and animal models and so forth. There's years of work that has gone into getting the idea developed far enough and getting a drug product that's ready to actually use in the clinic and to assess. But that's where our clinic comes in. That's the crucial step of taking a drug and actually evaluating it to see if it actually can be used safely and if it performs the way it's predicted to, and accomplishes something useful and worthwhile. So that's what phase 1 clinical studies are all about. The people come into these studies in each one is a unique story in a different path, because cancer is a very complicated subject. There are many different kinds of cancer. There are many different kinds of treatment. And really the decision of going into a study is a very individual study that requires, both from the point of view of the patient and from the point of view of the clinic, to make a very individualized assessment to decide, is this really going to be is this the most appropriate treatment of the options available to you right now? Is this the one that would be the most useful or worthwhile? And so that's part of a lot of what has to be done in the clinic, at least when someone comes for a first consultation, is to start working on making this kind of assessment from our side and from the patient's point of view too, of course.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Could you tell me a little more about how the trials actually work regarding the patient? They're coming in, maybe how you connect with them, and sort of what that process looks like for a patient. Are they coming in, weekly, monthly? Does it depend on the treatment? I would imagine. Kind of walk through that process for a patient.
Of course, people who are coming in are almost always have had some form of standard treatment, such as chemotherapy or perhaps surgery, radiation. In some cases, people have had a history of treatment for many years. And in some ways, what takes place in the clinic looks a lot like what they've seen before with chemotherapy. In other words, most of the investigational drugs are drugs that are administered either intravenously or oral, similar to existing treatments. We have some that are given as an injection directly into the tumor, and therefore that's not similar to anything that's done as standard of care. But in general, people are coming into the clinic to get treatment. It is different for each study. Some are weekly and some are monthly, and various schedules, depends on the details of exactly what is this treatment supposed to be, how is it supposed to work. And with those visits, of course, they're seeing the doctor, they're seeing other staff in the clinic, they're having lab tests done, imaging tests done, x-rays and so forth. Because part of the study is to evaluate very, very carefully and in great detail exactly what happens and what ways does this drug help, how does the drug work. So there are, in general, probably more studies done and more frequent visits than in standard treatment. And beyond that, there's a lot that goes on in the background that, of course, the patient doesn't see compared to the standard clinic. There's a lot of additional work between the clinic and the pharmaceutical company that developed the drug that has to be in place and kept up to date in order for the study to be conducted.
Gotcha. And so what are some of the most common cancers that are treated at Mary Crowley Cancer Research?
Well, we see people who have have cancers that are about the same frequency as what's generally encountered. That is, lung cancer, breast cancer, colorectal cancer, pancreatic cancer, ovarian cancer. Those are the most frequently encountered kinds of cancers. And so we see people kind of in proportion to the incidence. But there are a lot of, I guess, altogether, they're not so uncommon, but there are a lot of tumors that are considered rare cancers. For these, the situation is a bit different. In many cases, there's not not a lot of work has been done to develop an optimum treatment because they're not frequently encountered. But when you collect, there are a lot of people who have a tumor that's in that category. And so we try to have studies that could be appropriate for that situation as well.
Gotcha. And when do patients need to be referred to Mary Crowley from their oncologist or physician? Can I walk in the door? How does that process work?
Well, all of the people who come in are referred by their oncologist. But we have patients who contact us directly, even from out of state and so forth. And people are always welcome. They have a question, we'd like to try to see and try to assess and see if we have something to offer. But most are referred. And we like to encourage people to think about this earlier rather than later, to be aware of not necessarily that they're going to go into a study immediately, but to discuss it with their doctor and to be aware of what studies are there, what ideas are out there, so that they can have some awareness of that and try to decide as they go along in a course of treatment, at what point should they consider in being in a study.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay, great. And just as a reminder, as we're talking, audience, if you want to leave questions, and you can leave it at Facebook Live or here on Zoom, and we'll look at those at the end. So thanks, Dr. Strauss. We'll be back shortly. I'm going to kick it over to Mirchelle, who's going to talk a little bit about Cancer Support Community North Texas. So can you just tell me a little bit about the organization, what types of support you guys provide? We'll kind of start there.
Sure. Thank you, Will. Well, Cancer Support Community North Texas has been around for quite some time, in fact, since 2002. And we see ourselves as an essential complement to the really fantastic medical care that is out there in the community for cancer patients. And we come in on the psychosocial and emotional side of things, providing support groups, really a very comprehensive and robust program of support that includes things like support groups, individual counseling, healthy lifestyle and exercise, support for kids, social events, nutritional workshops, just anything that a cancer patient and or their family may find of value to them. And a big component of what we do is also providing good, well-founded information and educational opportunities for people to enhance their knowledge as they're going through this cancer journey or experience.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Can you talk a little bit about how your organization intersects with Mary Crowley Cancer Research?
Absolutely. I think one of the important things for us is both organizations, Mary Crowley Cancer Research, Cancer Support Community, are locally based and are here to serve the community and really are fabulous resources in the community that I think folks could well do, know much, much more about to their own benefit. And I already alluded to the fact that, information is so important to cancer patients. And if we think about the current situation, and how difficult it is to get good quality, reliable, valid information that's timely, I think that is a great intersection for Cancer Support Community and Mary Crowley, because we know that not as many cancer patients are getting the awareness and are getting access to clinical trials as they could. At the same time, we are there to inform folks and try and dispel some of those myths about, when do you go and look for a clinical trial? And having a resource like Mary Crowley in the community that we could say, hey, go ahead. Do you know about clinical trials? Do you know what's available in your community? Here's a fabulous resource for you to reach out to. So, I think at that level, we've worked out a really nice relationship because, Dr. Strauss very kindly kind of put a plug in for Cancer Support Community saying what a great organization we are, and we feel the same having Mary Crowley available to us.
Mm-hmm. Good. So when you're talking to cancer patients or their families about sort of the clinical trial piece of it, I mean, what is that kind of, can you dive a little bit deeper into like what that guidance looks like, and what are you telling them as far as when they should look or how? Can you talk a little bit more like what those conversations look like?
Yes, and again, going back to some of the things that Dr. Strauss said, I think it's never too early to put the idea of awareness about clinical trial availability in front of a cancer patient so that they can at least consider it. Because when you get a cancer diagnosis, everybody is so overwhelmed. There's so many things to deal with. You know, you've got such a checklist of items to go through on what you need to do first, that sometimes it's way down the line that somebody says to somebody, oh, you know, what about a clinical trial? And also, you mentioned that many folks kind of think, oh, clinical trials are there for, you know, at the back end when maybe other treatments have failed. So it's kind of putting it out there that this is a complement potentially to, you know, really comprehensive treatment that they're getting, and just raise the awareness. At minimum, ask the question. You know, we don't tell folks what to ask. We are definitely not the medical experts, but we'll say, speak to your physician, speak to your oncologist, ask the question, get informed, and then help them find, you know, if they ask us for more information, we do have some information that we can provide them at a very fundamental level.
Yeah. As someone who is in touch with patients frequently, or part of an organization that is kind of on the front line with patients and their families, what is, you know, sort of the average impression of a clinical trial? When you kind of mentioned a little bit, but what are folks coming in? Are they bringing the idea to you, or when you mention it, what does that first reaction look like?
I think the first reaction in many instances is, oh no, I don't, you know, I don't need a clinical trial, or clinical trials are only there when, you know, other treatment has failed. And so it's sort of like a last resort. And I think that's for us, it's trying to just raise the awareness that it may not necessarily be so, and that if you go ahead and find out, get more information now and have that in hand, it's only empowering to the patient when they go and visit with their oncologist. And, you know, I think sometimes even broaching the subject with the treating physician can even make it easier on the physician and open up a door for a conversation and for added information. And you know, the physician may say, look, you know, that's not needed now, but here's what could be. This could be a complement to your current treatment or whatever. And really, at least it opens up the door and raises the awareness.
Yeah, it's good. This question might not go anywhere, but when you have someone who's involved in the organization and then enters a trial, what does kind of your side of things, does anything change on your end as far as the type of support you're providing, Mirchelle?
I don't think the kind of support changes really very much for us. I think, you know, it just really depends on the individual who's going through a clinical trial. But there are possibilities where we can connect that person with somebody else who's going through a clinical trial, so that they can have that dialogue between them and can kind of create some support, you know, in that arena. And I think that's incredibly valuable, because regardless, when I think about the journey or the experience of a cancer patient, the beauty of what cancer support community is able to do for that person is create an environment where they can meet with other folks who are having a similar experience. And that, you know, that peer support is absolutely invaluable, because you're speaking to somebody who's actually experiencing it in real time with you, and you can share concerns, experiences, challenges, successes, you know, almost one-on-one with those individuals.
Yeah. Great. Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, just that ability to empathize with others, no matter where you are in the cancer process, being really important, and especially going into a little bit more perhaps unknown world of the clinical trial, just being able to connect those folks would be really powerful.
Sure.
Great. Well, we're gonna come back to you as well, but I'm gonna shift over to Tina, and I know you work with Mary Crowley and helping connect them to pharmaceutical companies who are looking to run trials. So that can be sort of an intense, complex process. So I wanted you to kind of talk us through a little bit about what your role looks like at Mary Crowley, and then I'll kind of follow up and see if we can understand kind of what goes on behind the scenes before a patient shows up and gets treatment.
Yes, so like you mentioned, I work to establish relationships with drug companies like Pfizer in order to increase Mary Crowley's exposure and to source trials that fit the patient population that we serve. A little about how we decide which trials to bring in to Mary Crowley. So like Dr. Strauss mentioned, we are a referral center. So as a referral center, most of our patients receive treatment with their primary oncologist prior to coming to us. Therefore, we are interested in trials that allow our patients to have had at least 2 prior lines of therapy. We also take into consideration the tumor types and or mutations that the trial requires. And so we look into our historical enrollment to see if those criteria fit our patient population. So the opening process can be quite technical, so I'm going to give a high-level overview. So once we have identified a trial that we want to pursue, we will begin opening process. And the opening process is like matchmaking. So we will ask a lot of questions regarding the nuances of the trial. And then the drug company like Pfizer will ask us a lot of questions, such as the accrual potential, our prior experience, and our logistical capabilities. If Mary Crowley and Pfizer want to proceed further, then we will go on a date, so to speak. So Pfizer will come on site onto Mary Crowley, and we will give them a tour of our facilities. And at the same time, Pfizer will confirm whether we have the equipment and the procedures in place to conduct their trial. So Mary Crowley was built to run clinical trials. So we have our pharmacy, our treatment area, and our lab all housed within our cancer center. And typically the drug companies are very impressed by this setup, and it's also convenient for our patients. So after the date happens, we just wait for Pfizer to notify us of whether they've picked us as a site. It can take some time before they let us know whether we've been picked because of the competitive nature of the selection process. So Pfizer is thoroughly evaluating over 20 cancer centers before they ultimately decide on 3. And Mary Crowley has been conducting trials for over 20 years, so more often than not, we are selected as a site. So getting from initial interest to this point can take anywhere from a month to a year. And then after we've been notified that we've been picked as a site, Pfizer will send us all the paperwork, and at that point, we have 10 weeks to process all that paperwork and get everything in place to run the trial. And then soon afterwards, they'll let us know that we are open for enrollment.
Cool. So I wanted to back you up a little bit on, you mentioned sort of the looking at the patient load, the historic sort of who you guys have treated, and trying to balance that with the potential trials that the pharmaceutical or research organization are pitching to you guys. Do you need a pool of, a certain type of cancer patient? Or do you just look at historic data and then put out the trial and see who shows up at that point? Or do you say, hey, we have 25 people with pancreatic cancer who are interested in a trial, so let's go and look for, that type of a trial? Or is that not how it works?
Well, so over the past year, we know exactly who enrolled to a trial and what tumor types they are. Mm-hmm. So if a pharmaceutical company comes to us with a trial that we've enrolled highly to, we are definitely interested in looking further. Gotcha. But at the same time, we also see, like Dr. Strauss mentioned, there are some tumor types that we just see a lot of that aren't proportionally seen more outside, such as sarcomas. So we personally go out and source trials for sarcoma because we have a big patient population for it.
Right, gotcha. That makes sense. So when you are kind of doing that date process, you're kind of both looking at, doing due diligence on each other, sort of making sure that process is up to each other's standards. Can you tell us a little bit about maybe some key things that you look for in the trial, and maybe some specific things that they're looking for, in Mary Crowley, whether it's facilities or staff or whatever?
Yes. So what we look for is that we have the patient population for it, and that we have the logistical capabilities to run the trial. So, for example, if it's a frontline trial, that could be difficult for us because most of our patients have already been previously treated.
Yeah.
And then we want to see that it's something that we can operationally do. And then what the drug company looks for is the same thing, that we have the patient population. So I know that they're going off our word on it, but we tell them that our prior enrollment numbers, and then also they come on site and see that we have the equipment, such as the -80, -20 freezers, and then they come and see our pharmacy, and then that everything that we're doing is our standard operating procedures are well thought out.
Yeah, gotcha. So imagine the average person doesn't know a lot about the world of where these trials take place. How unique is a center like Mary Crowley as far as you mentioned, it's specifically built for this purpose? Are most trials done in like academic medical centers? Are they all done in places like Mary Crowley? What does that look like as far as how common a place like Mary Crowley is?
Well, I think Mary Crowley is very special in that we only treat our patients on clinical trials. So patients don't come to us to get their standard of care treatment. And so at other sites, they're doing both. They're providing standard of treatment or standard of care, and they're also trying to enroll onto trials. And so I think what makes Mary Crowley special is that we run phase 1 trials, so we're dedicated to that, and those are most difficult to run because there's a lot of intense assessments that can be associated with these trials. And so in the standard of care world, it's difficult for them to do these phase 1 trials because they're so busy giving standard of care, whereas at Mary Crowley, clinical trials is all that we do. So we have all of the procedures in place to make sure that the research is good.
Gotcha. And can you give me a quick rundown, just difference between a phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trial, what that actually means?
Well, phase 1 trial is when it's usually the first time either it's being tested in humans. So it was preclinically tested, usually in animal models prior, but the first in humans are when it's the first time that investigational product is being tested in humans, and then, or that it's being tested in a new tumor type. And so generally the purpose is to find out the safety of this investigational product. And then next is the phase 2, where they test in a larger number of people to see where exactly it's efficacious. And then going on to phase 3 is even a larger number of people, where it's usually their registrational, like they know exactly which line and which type of patient that they want the approval in. And so it's a large number of patients, and then usually they take that for approval.
Gotcha. And Mary Crowley focuses on phase 1 or does all 3?
No, we're dedicated to phase 1 research. We run a little bit of phase 2, but most of our trials are phase 1.
Okay, great. Well, thanks. Very helpful. I'm going to chat with Jackie here for a minute. So it's pretty unique, I would guess, for a cancer research center to employ a social worker, right? You are part of the sort of wraparound services, I would imagine, offering things to these patients that they might not get elsewhere. So what kinds of things are you helping with as patients are coming into Mary Crowley and participating in these trials?
I think you're right, Will. I think that not all facilities do have full-time social workers. So I think that Mary Crowley is focused on patient care. And so one of the things that they do offer is to be able to have the full-time social worker. So a lot of times people usually ask, why do I need a social worker? If I'm getting my treatment, I'm doing okay. There's a lot of complexities that come with dealing with cancer. Things like understanding the basics of insurance, or or if for whatever reason you lose your insurance, figuring out what options are available to you to enroll into a new insurance. If you're at the point that you can't work any longer, what does that look like for you? Do you have any kind of options for disability, and what's the process to apply? For a lot of patients, financial can be a huge concern, especially if they have to stop working. So just kind of figuring out what kind of resources may be available to access treatment and to continue on treatment. And then, of course, the psychosocial piece, which is incredibly important, which all of these things that we just kind of talked about can impact the psychosocial and how people are feeling, how if they're anxious, if they're stressed out. And that's kind of where we kind of talked about that cancer support community can help with these type of things where they can offer that support. If a family or caregiver is needing to connect with a support group. So I kind of go in and make sure that the family's needs, not just the patient, but the family's needs are being taken care of, and that we're eliminating any kind of barrier so that they can continue on trials.
Gotcha. How about can you give us a few sort of common questions or concerns, kind of specifics that you get from patients? You dive a little deeper on a few of those.
Yeah, I think that there's conception sometimes about the cost of clinical trials. I think that's probably a question that I get from patients and caregivers. So we'll kind of talk about that a little bit. So typically there are two costs. There's a patient care cost, and then there's what we call the research cost. Patient care costs are going to be things that typically you would normally get at a standard of care clinic. So typical things would be hydration, if you need to see the doctor for an office visit, any kind of imaging that is regularly due to happen. Those things would be billed through insurance, and depending on how much you owe for out of pocket, the patient may be responsible for that. What the research costs are and what is not what the patient doesn't pay for are going to be things that are the investigator or the research company is investigating. So the actual drug that's being investigated, if there's additional testing that's not part of what you would normally see in a regular clinic, those are paid for by the research company. I do also get a lot of questions about whether or not insurance pays for people to be enrolled in clinical trials. We usually don't have many issues with people getting onto a clinical trial and insurance paying for what we call the standard of care. What I think is unique about Mary Crowley and what I love is that there's an amazing program for those who may have a concern about the cost, because there, of course, what we talked about, there might be some potential costs. There is a benevolence program that if they are concerned about it, they can apply, and if they do get approved for it, they could potentially get some help with some reimbursement of the out-of-pocket costs that they incur.
Good. And I imagine just because of the nature of all the different cancers that are treated or go through folks that go through trials at Mary Crowley, you get folks from all walks of life, all ages, from young to old. Can you talk a little bit about sort of what that's like to kind of balance me? I'm sure every person that's walking in is not a 65-year-old woman, middle-class woman, and you have a repetitive conversation. How does Mary Crowley sort of adapt to the different types of folks that are coming through and dealing with those trials?
So I think from my perspective, one of the things that I do, because of the size of the clinic, I'm able to meet with everybody on usually day one of treatment or soon after. And I'm talking to every single patient. And if there's a caregiver in the room, I'm talking to the caregivers. So I'm getting a baseline of understanding of what's going on in their family, if there's any stressors, any kind of concerns that they have on the front end that hopefully I know that I can help to alleviate and not cause an issue to stop or hinder any kind of clinical trial participation. So I think that's pretty unique. I don't know that any other facility would be able to meet with every single patient on day one, or at least have a conversation so that they know that I am here if they do need the services. So kind of like what you said, not every patient is coming here is going to be a certain age or level of care. So that's one of the things that I'm taking into consideration. So if there is a concern or a barrier that I might think that might be an issue, because I find out so quickly, I can alert the team so that they become aware and they can help me kind of figure out how to brainstorm and how to get the person the care that they need.
Gotcha. So one last question. So I don't know what the exact like geographic sort of range that patients are coming from. They're coming from Mary Crowley. Can you tell us a little about sort of where these folks are coming from, and if you live farther away, are there options, or how do you guys work with those folks?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and something that if anybody is concerned about, we do have options for it. Obviously, depending on where they're coming from, we're going to take a look at what kind of national and local resources are going to be available. I know the National Cancer Support Community has the Airbnb program. We are always looking at the other local resources if they're having to stay here for longer term. And so if that is a concern while they're in the screening phase of taking a look at see if the trial is right for them, and if they make the patient, or if they tell the doctor or the people helping with the screening, they let me know on the front end so I can help with those type of things. We can potentially connect to see if the sponsor might be willing to pay for hotel or for mileage, which it does happen in quite a few cases. And so we're always brainstorming, of course, eliminate that as a barrier.
Sure. Great point. I think a good segue to kind of while we're talking about sort of support and kind of resources, wanted to just ask Mirchelle, could you talk a little bit, you've kind of mentioned a few of the different sort of programs that are available. Could you maybe highlight 2 or 3, peer group therapy and kind of what those are about, what that looks like for the average patient and their family?
Absolutely. And, I just want to kind of tag on to something that Jackie said also. I think it's essential for us to bear in mind that when we have a patient going through cancer treatments or engaged in a trial, it's the patient, but it's also their family that we have to be very, very mindful of, because everybody's involved, everybody is impacted. And so that's, one of the things also that Cancer Support Community does is our program is for the patient and also for anybody connected to that person, whether it's a family member, friend, or co-worker. So, they can do, especially given the fact that you might have some folks coming to Mary Crowley who are not in Dallas. We have a very robust virtual program of support, which has become especially apparently important now during the time of this pandemic. So folks can get that support by attending a virtual support group, or, getting individual counseling, or listening to programs like this, or engaging in some, healthy lifestyle, whether it's yoga or meditation. It's that connection to other people. And that's, it's wonderful if we can encourage that one-on-one connection and put people into circumstances, where they are socializing with other folks as well. I think that's very important. So the whole of the Cancer Support Community program is very mindfully created to support any person at any point in their journey, whether it's from new diagnosis to long-term survivorship. We are there to kind of let the person take advantage of what we offer. Very patient-centric, which I think is something that aligns us very closely also with Mary Crowley. This is definitely not a one-size-fits-all. Every person is different. They may even have the same diagnosis, but it's never the same diagnosis because of the individual. So it's looking at that person in their environment, at the whole person, including their family, and saying, what more can we do to support you as you go along this route? And knowing that they're not alone. And I think that patient-centric focus and being available at any pretty much 24/7 for cancer support community, because as part of a national organization, we also have those resources that are available to folks. So it's kind of like a wraparound. And I think it doesn't really get any better than that for a patient who is going through treatment or engaging in a clinical trial, that they don't feel that they're out there on the edge of this precipice on their own.
That's a great point. I'm going to chat with Dr. Strauss here for a second. This, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like there might be sort of a dual stigma maybe that you guys are working on. One sort of a geographic one, and another sort of just the nature of clinical trials. My wife, she's actually she's a palliative care physician. And so she works with a lot of cancer patients, talks to folks. And I know that's something that she deals with, that when she wants to meet with the family, when she wants to, have a consult, there's this assumption, like if they know what palliative care is, like, oh, I don't want to talk to that person. That means I'm it's bad news and I'm going to die and this and that. And so I'm not sure if that's a stigma that you guys experience with patients for clinical trials, but was curious on how you sort of deal with that or talk with patients about just maybe a general stigma away from even entering into something like this because of what it says about their prognosis.
On?
Yeah.
Hello? Yeah. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, I guess you've asked several questions. It is complicated. As we've already discussed several times, that every patient is unique and every case and story is different. So it does require a lot of consideration. Studies are not for everybody, and there can be, unfortunately, there certainly can be a situation where a study is not the answer because there is an unknown with a study. Since it's a drug in early development, that means risks are not completely known. We haven't treated enough people to actually know for sure, and that puts some constraints on how studies are conducted. So there's a great interest and desire to be sure that we can be able to assure safety. And so the result of that is that not everybody who would consider being in a study is necessarily able to enroll in a study. And so each and every study has its own set of enrollment criteria, rules and regulations. And these unfortunately sometimes exclude somebody who would choose to be in a study if they could. So it's not always easy or automatic. And there's always some negotiation in both directions. For that matter, we sometimes are confronted with a problem that we want to go back to the company developing the drug and try to get them to change the rules or regulations in this particular case. And if we can make a good explanation or case for that, then there are certainly many situations where they'll make an exception or change the criteria if we can point that out. But in some cases, turns out it's simply not the best answer for what to do. So each one of those is a very individual discussion. And I think a lot of these discussions can only be made by someone if they're interested, they have to come in and just take a look so that both we can find out what their situation is and what their concerns and questions are, and know enough about their case and their treatment to be able to give them an assessment. Is this a good choice for you or not? Do we have something to offer? And then we can proceed.
Makes sense. Yeah. I would imagine part of that process of finding whether a trial is going to work for you or what trials are available is, part of the challenge. I understand Mary Crowley there's an app there. Can you talk a little bit about that as far as how that's used for patients to kind of navigate and get connected to Mary Crowley?
Yes, well, there is some aspects of this that are very technical. And so we've discussed a lot this afternoon that the clinic is trying to be as aware as possible of all of the ways that a tumor and a cancer affects a patient and the family, and keep all of these issues in mind to be able to provide care. There are some very technical aspects in terms of the decision about which study is appropriate. And sometimes this depends on the genetics of precisely what mutations have occurred in this tumor and what is the precise treatment history. And so some of the studies are very specific in that regard. And again, that's part of what we try to do, is to do the best we can to match the studies available to what is a person's situation. So the app does list some things. You can search in some cases by what specific genetic mutation is involved. And so I don't know if that's necessarily always useful to the general public. It is. There are some people who have very detailed information about what their situation is. We feel that it's, or hope that it's also useful to the oncologists in town who are considering whether their patient ought to look into being in a study, to have an awareness of what studies are currently out there and which ones might show some approach that is otherwise not available.
Okay, gotcha. So the app is maybe geared a little bit more toward an oncologist than the average patient.
That's what I think. I don't know, Tina can respond maybe.
Yeah, Tina, you have any follow-up there?
Well, I think that it's also beneficial for the patients, maybe so they know what's out there. We do try to put as much publicly available information, such as the mechanism of the drug and the inclusion-exclusion criteria. But it's also useful in that you can share that information. So if you click the share button, they can share it via email or text with their oncologist or with someone else, or maybe if they're searching for a friend who has cancer, they can share it via, through that method. And also it's a way for them to contact us. So on the trial page, if they click on the contact button, they can actually get in contact with one of our research staff and ask any questions to see if they are a fit, and we can schedule a consult visit with them. So we try to make it as informative as we can, because a lot of information can be confidential. So we put what we can put, and then we try to make it simple and user-friendly for everyone.
Gotcha. Yeah, makes sense. So we got 15-ish minutes. We might go over a little bit if everyone can, because we're getting some really great questions in from the audience. So I want to take some time to shift to those real quick. So one question was about just engaging minority participation in trials and what that process looks like as far as trying to find patients, or if there is a search for a diverse, patients with diverse backgrounds and trying to understand how it affects a different community. I don't know if that would be a question for Dr. Strauss or maybe Jackie, as far as supporting diverse trial populations and what that looks like as far as trying to find those patients.
Maybe we can all each take an answer to that. It's fine. But it's I don't have any statistics or numbers, so I don't know, but it's a very diverse population. For example, we have the issue that comes up all the time about translating documents into other languages. So we have a service to be able to get that accomplished. So we have patients who, from all over, or at least speaking all sorts of languages. So there's nothing that limits that kind of access at all, as far as I know. Maybe Jackie wants to comment.
Yeah, so I do speak fluent Spanish, not that that's the only language, but one of the things that I'm working on is to try to access the Hispanic population, just to explain to them about the basics of clinical trials. And then making sure that if there is another population or another language, and if after they get on board with clinical trials, if they're needing whatever they need, whether it be support or otherwise, trying to find that resource in their language. And so not just obviously the Spanish, but other languages where they may need to access any kind of support, whatever that may look like for them.
Yeah. Mirchelle, could you talk a little about cancer support community and how you guys are, expressing cultural sensitivity and kind of working with different populations?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it comes down every time to education and information. And so from cancer support community has a couple of things, well, more than a couple of things, but we also have a cancer resource specialist who, like Jackie, is a social worker, bilingual Spanish. But then in addition to that, we have Spanish language support groups that meet regularly as well. And I know that we've had presentations, for example, on clinical trials and that kind of thing in Spanish. Jackie's done those for us in the past. I think, again, it's breaking down those barriers and removing the challenges of access to care. And the more that we can reach out into the communities and engage them, I think the more opportunities you've got to put the information in front of folks and say, ask the questions. We've spoken how complex cancer is and how complex cancer treatments are, and the developments that are coming out in terms of, new treatments and new ways of looking at things. My gosh, it's so overwhelming that finding ways to deliver that information to folks in a very meaningful way, I think, is critically important. And finding how to do that, because a support group may not be the right thing for everybody. So then how do we reach those folks? Is it initially through a social event, or if folks can't get into our clubhouses, can we find ways to put that information out there on a virtual platform like we're using today? And that can be incredibly successful. But again, there's a challenge, do the folks we're trying to reach have access to the technology that's needed to even watch programs like ours? So it's a constant challenge, and, thinking creatively about how do we reach different segments of our population and encourage them to ask the questions and get the information. Sure.
That's good. I have a couple, these might be quick answer questions for Dr. Strauss on sort of the trial process, but one came in from the audience is, can you talk a little about how long it takes for a patient to begin a trial after they've been referred? What does that window look like? And maybe the average length of a phase 1 clinical trial?
Yes, well, of course, we need to see someone if they're interested for a consultation visit. So we try to get visits scheduled pretty quickly within 1 to 2 weeks of contact. And then, if someone is in a study, they can only be on one treatment at a time. So it's necessary to not, you have to have a reason to switch into a study and discontinue whatever the prior treatment has been. And usually there's some period of time that's required by the study in which there has been no treatment, so-called washout, for whatever the last treatment was to have dissipated before starting in the study. In most cases, that's a matter of 2 weeks or so. And so we try to have several things running at the same time. In order to start in a study, there's usually additional lab and scans and so forth that are required. And those can be done during while this washout period of time is going by. So we try to have the shortest interval that we can between someone coming in for consultation and being able to actually get underway in a study. Almost all of these studies are open-ended in terms of duration. It's not true of every one of them, but it is true of the majority have a very similar study design. And that is that once before treatment starts, in almost every study, we have to decide precisely what are we going to use as an indicator of response. And most often that is something that can be measured on a CT scan or some other X-ray or imaging. And we have a couple of radiologists who have worked with the clinic for many years, and they are given the task before someone actually starts treatment to look at the scan and write down what is it that will be used as an indication. In other words, is there a spot somewhere that can be measured, write it down, record that. And then once treatment starts, usually every 6 to 8 weeks, the imaging, the same study is repeated and the same radiologist gives us the measurement, so that we want to have assessment as to, can we show that this is actually helping? If the tumor has not grown, or obviously if it's gotten smaller, then that's good, and they should and the treatment should continue. If it's not effective, then we don't want anyone to stay on treatment. We want to look and see what else can we move on to. So, but it's open-ended. So in some cases, people are on the same. We have, I think, one woman I can think of who's on a phase 1 study now 5 years. So if the treatment is working, then nobody wants to change. We shouldn't.
Sure.
So it's open-ended, and typically.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you kind of, just another audience question. Do you feel like you kind of touched on it, but maybe just clarify. So the trial procedure, you've kind of established it. Is there wiggle room as far as being able to tailor a trial treatment to fit individual patients, or does the scientific method require that you do the same thing for everyone? Is time the only sort of variable that you're able to change? What does that look like?
Well, these studies are fairly heavily designated and controlled and regulated. And so there are a lot of things that can't be varied. Usually before every treatment, of course, there's assessment of how are you doing, and are there changes in the condition, in someone's condition, that need to be addressed before continuing treatment. Mm-hmm. And then lab tests and so forth. And usually those things all have to be in a pretty narrow range to allow safe continuation of treatment. And so it varies, but in many of those, the study is pretty carefully defined.
Right. Okay. Makes sense. Cool. So we just got a few more minutes left here, and we've kind of touched on most of the questions that aren't super specific, but I thought we would maybe take a last few minutes. Mirchelle, if you wanted to just kind of give us a couple takeaways that you want viewers to understand about cancer support community, North Texas, their work with Mary Crowley, something for folks to kind of walk away with.
Absolutely. I would encourage folks to check out Cancer Support Community because of what we can add in terms of removing some of the hurdles and the barriers that they may be experiencing, just providing information, making those social connections. Again, we're very individual or patient-centric. And I think that is something that aligns us very closely, again, with Mary Crowley. It's user-friendly. We want, cancer is, again, such a complex and overwhelming situation to be walking through. And so anything that we can do that's going to make that easier for the individual, for their families, for the communities, for how they interact and do well, because we do know that getting support, psychosocial and emotional support while you're going through a cancer treatment actually can be immensely beneficial at so many levels, not excluding how well you do with treatment, etc. So we want to encourage that. We want to encourage people to get the information, ask the questions, know what their local resources are, and just reach out, make the phone call, whether it's to us for more information, whether it's to Mary Crowley for more information. What I love about both organizations is you're going to get a person that you can speak to. You're not going to go, dial 3 for this and 4 for that and 5 for that, and then get knocked off the line. You are going to find a human being who's going to chat with you at the end of your conversation. So I think that's incredibly valuable.
Yeah. And Dr. Strauss, maybe you could finish this up. I know, Mary Crowley's based here in North Texas. It might be that the average viewer or cancer patient or someone who's a caregiver might not realize what a hub sort of North Texas is for cancer clinical trials and research there. What would you say to folks who are thinking about it, or they're caregiver of someone, letting them know they don't have to go to Cleveland or Houston or wherever to to get a trial. Can you talk a little bit about sort of what kind of North Texas represents and Mary Crowley represents for the local community?
Well, sure. Yes, the clinic has been active for 20 years, and Tina and her colleagues do a lot of work to keep the clinic in contact with many different pharmaceutical companies, large and small. Some of these are the largest corporations around, and some are startups that are devoted to one single product. But so it's it's quite a long list of places that we're in contact with to assess what do they have to offer and try to get the studies that we think are best. So we have quite a few studies open at any given time. And many of these studies, we're not the only place in the country doing the study. I would say on average, there are 4, 5, 6, maybe 10 other sites around the country simultaneously working on the same study. And so we have these experience many times as people have gone to look at other places or travel, and they find out that we're doing the same study that they were told about somewhere else at some remote another city. So we try to have enough available so that we think we have a good chance of having something to offer for patients with a wide variety of different kinds of cancer problems.
Yeah, that's a great point. Well, great. We've kind of reached the end of our time and hit most of our questions. So I want to thank you guys, you panelists, for joining us and sharing. I know I learned a lot. I hope the viewers did as well. If you guys out there have more questions, there are lots of ways to get in touch. One big way would be the Mary Crowley Cancer Research app, where you can learn about the apps that are going on, get connected, work with your oncologist to find out more. So be sure to check that out. Also, both Mary Crowley and Cancer Support Community, they have websites. They're on Facebook, so go find them, marycrowley.org, cancersupporttexas.org, and you can find out more information and get your questions answered there. But again, thank you guys for viewing, and if there are more questions that you want answered, reach out to these folks, because that's their job. They're here for you. So hopefully you learned a little bit about Mary Crowley, a little bit about Cancer Support Community, and all the great things going on with cancer clinical trials here in North Texas. So thank you guys. Stay safe and enjoy being at home, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Will. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.